Hi, welcome back to the channel. This video is talking about the things that you absolutely must avoid when you're buying property. I know it's really competitive out there at the moment and there's a lot of people who want to buy, and it's easy to look at a property and think, well, this isn't quite right, but it's the best I can do at the moment, so I'll just buy it anyway. But you've got to remember the golden rules. There are certain things with property that you cannot change. I've been developing properties for over 20 years and I've done everything that you can imagine to properties. Extended, remodeled, rebuilt, everything. But there are certain aspects of a property that you are not in control of, that you cannot change. And they have a huge impact on both the value of the property and also your enjoyment of living in that property. So you've got to stay focused on avoiding certain things because they will firstly hit you financially, and secondly, they will drive you crazy when you're living in those properties. So you've got to think about what impact certain things will have on your house. So we're going to do a reverse countdown from 10 to 1, and number 1 being the one thing that everybody absolutely has to avoid. It is the golden rule. Do not buy a property that has the number 1 issue attached to it. Before we get into that, please smash the like button, give us a thumbs up, and please subscribe if you haven't already. And let's get down to the top 10 things to avoid when you're buying a property. So number 10, a north-facing garden. Now, apologies for anybody in the Southern Hemisphere who's watching this, because if you're living in Australia or somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere, then a north-facing garden is absolutely what you want. But in the UK, in the US, and anywhere else in the Northern Hemisphere, a north-facing garden means that your garden is going to be in shade all day long. And whilst that might not seem like a big issue, and whilst you might think, well, it doesn't really matter, it will matter. And it will have an impact on the value of that property. So you will find on a road which has got houses that face north and south, that all of the houses that have south-facing gardens and therefore are in the sun all day long, they will have a higher value than the houses on the opposite side of the road that have north-facing gardens. Because in a north-facing garden, not only is your garden in shade, but the whole back of your house is in shade. And quite often these days, everybody has their kitchen, dining, living room at the rear. It's the nice space to have that opens out onto the garden. And that is going to be in shade all day as well. So that will mean quite often you'll have to have the lights on during the day. It's really not a great living environment. But fundamentally, the value of properties with north-facing gardens is lower than it is for south-facing gardens. So I'll tell you a quick joke. Why did the property developer cross the road? To get to the south-facing garden. So, and that there's a lot of truth in that everybody wants a south-facing garden. I know a lot of examples of people who've moved house on the same road just to change the aspect of their garden. So they will move over the road, they'll pay all the extra money just to turn the garden around. So it really is a big issue. Gardens are very important to houses and families and people who live there. So it's really a big issue for you to consider. So maybe you don't have a choice, but if you have a choice, try to get a south-facing garden. If you can't get south, get west is the next best option, but ideally avoid a north-facing garden. Number 9 on the list of things to avoid when you're buying a property, train tracks. Quite often you'll find a house that looks great value. You think, wow, this is so much cheaper than the other properties in this area that I'm looking at. Fantastic. And then when you go to view that property, you'll find that down the bottom of the garden, there is a railway track. And that railway track may only have the occasional train, or it may have lots of frequent trains. But either way, it will cause noise, and that noise will continue from early in the morning through to late at night. And that will drive you mad when you live there. Every time those trains go past, you'll hear it. Depending on how severe the trains are, how fast they're traveling, and how big they are. It may cause your house to vibrate and rattle. You've seen movies where people are having cups of tea and all of the crockery starts to rattle. That's actually true. Those things do happen. You will be lying in bed, and if a big express train goes past down the bottom of your garden, you'll suddenly start to shake in bed. None of that's good. None of that's good for both the living environment, but also for the value. Those properties will always have a lower value than other properties in the same area. And it doesn't matter what you do to that house. You can develop it and you can do amazing things. People will always pay you less for that property because of the train track. And living there is always stressful because if you've got children or pets, you're always worried about them getting out onto the train tracks or something disastrous happening. So avoid train tracks if you can. Number 8 on the list, sticking with the theme of transport, a bus stop. Now, bus stop sounds like a great idea because it's convenient. You can jump out of your house, jump onto the bus. Great. But actually, if you have a bus stop directly outside your property, there are a couple of problems with that. The first one is that people hang around at bus stops. So you will have people congregating outside your house, outside your garden, maybe sitting on your wall, maybe sitting in your garden, leaving litter, leaving cigarette butts, leaving things that you don't want them to leave around your property. So that's for the first issue. You'll have some people congregating and hanging about your property. The second issue is to do with access to your property. So depending on where the bus stop is and how it operates, that could impact on your ability to park near to your house because you're not allowed to park on bus stops, and creating access to your property, being able to park at your property might be a problem. And then finally, you'll have the issue of buses generally travel on busier roads. So if a bus stops there, it will stop for a while, and therefore a lot of traffic might build up behind the bus whilst it's waiting for it to load up. And that's producing pollution and noise and generally an irritant for you as the householder. So bus stops, not great to be located right outside your property or very near to your property. So have a look around, look at where bus stops are, see where they're situated in respect to the property you're looking to buy. And if it's right outside or very close to the property, avoid it. Number 7 on the list, restaurants. So it might sound great to have a restaurant on your doorstep and think, oh, fantastic. We can nip out and we can have some tea and go for a meal and be really convenient. But actually, having a restaurant very close to your house is bad news for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there is the noise factor that restaurants obviously attract people and crowds, and there will be lots of people coming and going to that restaurant. So at certain times, you may find that it's noisy, whether it be lunchtime. If they've got tables outside, then it's generating noise, both at lunchtime and the evenings, or just people meeting before they go in, or late at night when they come out of the restaurant, they may stand around talking and chatting and having a bit of fun and a bit of a laugh. That's great for them. It's not great for you if you're in bed, if you've got children in bed. You don't want people creating noise late at night and generally causing some sort of commotion. The other issues with restaurants are that they have large bins. So their refuge, their rubbish, is usually held in really large storage bins. And because there's food involved and food waste, then generally that attracts vermin. So it might be rats or other forms of vermin know that there's food in that area and they will come, and they will generally be in the local vicinity. And that means they're in the local vicinity to your house. And generally that vermin then will look for other sources of food and could end up in your garden, in your house, in your drains. Really not pleasant. But that's the main issue, is that restaurants have a lot of waste and it attracts unpleasant smells and it attracts vermin. So it might be just flies, or it could be rats, or it could be something worse than that. So really best to avoid that. And the final issue with restaurants, if you live close to a restaurant, then quite often people are driving to that restaurant to have their meal, and they'll be looking for somewhere to park. And I've lived next door to a restaurant, and I had a parking space outside my house, and every single week I would come home at some point and somebody would be parked outside my house in my driveway going to that restaurant. And we've had famous footballers parking outside of my house and just general everybody you can imagine. And it is really incredibly annoying. If you come home in your car and you look to park in your drive and there is a vehicle in your drive, it drives you insane. I used to live in Battersea in London, and we had a house that was close to a very famous Italian restaurant. And on one particular occasion, we had Gianfranco Zola's massive Range Rover parked outside of our house. And we had to go into the restaurant and ask Mr. Zola to remove his vehicle. Really, really incredibly irritating. So avoid restaurants at all costs. Number 6 on the list, flight path. So being close to an airport does sound quite attractive, quite handy if you want to go on holiday. Great, really convenient. But living in a flight path, living in an area where planes constantly go over your house does drive you mad. Planes are noisy and they come regularly. If you live somewhere on the flight path where they're coming into land, then that tends to be the noisiest part of it. And if busy periods, if you live next to a busy airport, you may find that they're coming over every minute. So you might have a plane for 12 hours a day coming in every single minute, and it will drive you insane. Now, people do say, well, you get used to the noise after a while, you don't notice it. You do notice it. I've sat in the garden with people while planes constantly come overhead, and it does drive you mad. And it happens day and night, and they start early in the morning. So you might find flights are starting at 3, 4, 5 a.m. And in some airports, at certain times of year, they also have flights through the night. So if you can avoid it, do not buy a property that is in the flight path of any major airport. And number 5 on the list is water. Now, what do I mean by water? I mean a stream or a brook or a river. So being close to a water course, to somewhere where water is running, sounds idyllic. And when you look at it in pictures or on the TV, it looks great to have a lovely brook or stream running down the bottom of your garden. But actually, in terms of flood risk and insurance, it is not a good thing. So each year with global warming, we're seeing more and more extreme weather, and we're seeing more flooding, and areas that have never previously flooded are suddenly starting to have issues. So the insurance companies have a map of every single area, and they plot where water is flooding. And areas of high risk, they will either not insure you, or the premiums will be through the roof. They will be very expensive. And that's a big problem for you. Firstly, you may not be able to get insurance. Secondly, it could be very expensive. And thirdly, it will be a problem when you come to sell that property. Because these days, when people are buying property, they're doing a search, they're looking at where all the water is in your area, whether there's been any floods, what the likelihood of a flood risk is, and it will put buyers off, and it will reduce the price of that property. And if that property has actually been flooded, if it's experienced a flood, then it becomes really, really difficult for you to sell it, because nobody wants to buy a house where they could potentially be wiped out by a flood. And it is really important to avoid areas of high flood risk. And you'll find just because you don't want to buy it means nobody else wants to buy it, the price goes down and it becomes self-defeating. And actually, there are some areas now where houses are virtually worthless because water has been a constant problem for them and flooding has been an issue, and they just can't sell those properties. So avoid water at all costs. Number 4 on the list is electricity. So we all depend on electricity. It's really important. We couldn't live without it. But the system that transmits electricity requires various substations and pylons and areas where there is a big buildup of electricity. So it might be that in a residential area that there's a substation every half a mile, and these are generally small buildings which have really intense generators in there. They have a lot of power going through them. Or it could be it's pylons, so it's big metal constructions that are carrying power cables between areas from the power station to the local residential area, or it could be the mass electricity substation. So you've seen these which look, they're the size of football pitches, they're really large, and they have lots and lots of different generators within them. There's been a lot of research in living close to this infrastructure, and some reports say that it is possible to catch cancer from living close to this sort of electricity substation. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm not trying to talk medical issues on this channel, but even if there is a 0.01% chance of catching cancer living close to those things, I'm not going to take it. And the majority of the population do not want to take that risk. So what happens? It means the price of that property plummets. Nobody wants to live there. Nobody wants to buy it. So that's a major issue. But more importantly, living in that property, even if there's a minuscule risk of catching some sort of cancer or problem, or you hear reports about people living close to power lines and substations where they've constantly got headaches, or they've got tinnitus in the ears where their ears are constantly ringing, or they just feel they can't sleep at night because there's a constant humming noise in the air. So whatever the issue is, whether it's true or whether it's psychosomatic, it doesn't really matter. The issue is people don't want to live close to major sources of electricity, and therefore it will reduce the value of that property. And also, if you live there, it will be a form of stress. It will play on your mind. If you've got children playing in the garden close to electricity sources, it's really not nice. Firstly, you're worried about the health implications. And secondly, there is the actual danger of, if the children manage to get into that area or something happens, then it could be disastrous. So avoid electricity at all costs. Number 3 on the list is a small garden. Well, that doesn't sound too bad. A small garden is better than no garden, and I agree with that. It is. So if it's your first house and first garden, then maybe you'll be happy to take up a small garden. But the problem with small gardens is that you cannot change them. There is nothing you can do to that garden to make it better. You can't extend it. You can't dig down and make it double story. There's nothing you can do. So you could develop the house, you can make it amazing, you could make it one of the most attractive houses in the area, but the small garden will put people off, and it will put buyers off, and also if you live there, after a while, it will drive you mad. And I know because I've got a house with a small garden, and I bought it about 10 years ago, and at the time, it was the best house I could afford, and I wanted a big garden. I bought one with a small garden because I thought, well, it doesn't really matter. And it's driven me mad ever since I moved in here. And I always wish I'd bought a house with a bigger garden. And I've changed every single thing about my house. I've done everything you can imagine to it, but I haven't been able to do anything to the garden because you can't do anything with a small garden. So hopefully you're getting the message. A small garden cannot be changed. It will drive you mad after a while. And if there's a better choice, if you can buy a worse house with a better garden, I would always recommend that, because you can change the house when you get some money or whatever. You can do something to the house, but you can't change the garden. So don't buy a house with a small garden. Number 2 on the list is a busy road. If you buy a house that is on a main road, a really busy road, it will have a number of negative impacts on both the value of that property and your enjoyment of that property. Nobody wants to live next to a busy road. It's constant noise. You've got constant traffic going backwards and forwards. It really generates a lot of noise both around the area but also in your house. So even with double glazing and triple glazing, you'll still hear the drone of the traffic. You hear that motorbike who suddenly decides to rev his engine as he's going past your house. You'll hear the ambulance and the fire engine and the police car when they're sticking their sirens on. So busy roads generate a lot of noise. Quite often they generate a lot of people as well. So you might have, in addition to all the cars, a lot of people moving backwards and forwards, walking back up and down if it's a busy thoroughfare. So that's going to generate more traffic on the people side, more noise, more litter, just more aggravation if you're living in that property. And the knock-on impact of a busy road is pollution. So we haven't got full electric cars yet. Everybody's still using petrol and diesel. So all of the vehicles that are using that busy road are generating pollution. And if you live close to a busy road, you'll be living in a high pollution area. And that means that you and your family will be living in a high pollution area, and also your property is going to suffer. So you see on busy roads, all the properties tend to dirty quicker. So the pollution will get onto the windows and get onto the walls and the roof and your car, it's parked outside. And generally there will be more pollution and particles and dust and dirt in the air. So your property and your family will be getting covered in pollution, which is not great. And generally being on a busy road will mean that the value of that property is significantly lower than other properties in that area. Whenever you look at an area, if you find a house that's really cheap, you'll usually find that it's on that busy road that nobody wants to live on. And all the people I know who live on busy roads constantly say to me, I want to move. I wish I hadn't bought this property. I'd rather have bought something further away that wasn't on this road. So avoid busy roads at all costs. So number 1 on the list is nightmare neighbours. So the final thing that you cannot change is the neighbours. And the issue with neighbours is obviously you've got no control over who lives next door to you. So neighbours can change. So that's something that you can't really legislate. But when you buy a property, you need to have a look at who the neighbours are. Do some investigation. Have a look who is in the house next door. If it's a house that's adjoined to other properties, it's really important to know who the people are in the house that are on either side of you if you're attached to them. So if it's a terraced house and you've got people on both sides, you need to find out who lives in both of those properties. And quite often, you'll find a seller is very willing to accept the lower price and to do a deal because they hate their neighbours and they can't wait to move away from that property. So have a look. When you get to the property, it might seem that everything else on this list is not applicable. So it's not near water or electricity. It's not on a busy road. It's got a nice garden. It's south facing. You might think, wow, this is a dream property. Why is it a lot cheaper than other properties I've looked at in this area? When you look at the houses either side of it, you need to start thinking about who lives there and what the issues are. So if you get to that property and you find there's a whole load of old machinery in the front garden, or they've got 6 cars that they're all in different states of repair, all put outside the property, or there is tons and tons of building materials lying around that don't look like they're used for a current build project, or there's loads of rubbish in that garden, or it is a complete dump. The whole place looks like it's about to be demolished. All of these things are signs that the people who live there are not people that you want as your neighbour. Or you might see the neighbours and you might notice that they look particularly unpleasant, or that they're not the sort of people that you would expect to live in that area, and they're creating maybe some social issues or other factors. You need to have a look at who the neighbours are and whether or not you think they will be nice people to live next door to. Because ultimately, if you're living in that property, you're going to have to spend a lot of time there. You will have interaction with the neighbour, whether you like it or not. If they're very noisy or disruptive or pollutive or constantly doing things in the back garden that are irritating to you, it will have an impact on your life. And therefore, you need to make sure that you're comfortable that whoever lives there is somebody that you're happy to live next door to for a long period of time. And when it comes to selling that property, the neighbours will have an impact on the value. So some of the issues I mentioned earlier, if there's visible signs that that particular household is antisocial, so they've got a lot of old machinery or lots and lots of things in the front garden that shouldn't be there, old mattresses and sofas and things like that, then that will devalue your property. Because when people buy property, they're aspirational. They're thinking about moving up in the world. They want to go somewhere that is an improvement, and hopefully they want to spend some money, make that house better. So the nightmare neighbours, firstly, will devalue your property, but more importantly, they will make your life hell. You will hate living in that property. If you hate your neighbour, you'll hate your house and you will want to move, and you will regret the day that you bought it. So that's the lasting message from this video. Do not buy a house with nightmare neighbours. Do a bit of research, Find out who lives on either side, if there's two sides, or one side if it's just one. Find out who lives there. Get a feel for what they look like. Have a look at their car. Have a look at the sort of people they are. How many children have they got? How many pets have they got? Do they seem like normal people to live next door to? And if they do, that's great. If they don't, then have a good think about it. And in a worst case scenario, go knock on the door. It's a big investment. It's a big decision when you're buying a house. Go knock on the door and say, hey, I'm thinking about buying a house next door. Just wanted to say hello and see what the reaction is. If they're nice people and they invite you in for a drink and they want to talk to you and get to know you, then that's great. If they do something far less pleasant, then you know that that's a sign not to buy that property. So hopefully this top 10 has been fun, interesting and useful to you. As I said at the beginning, please smash the like button and give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching and I will see you again soon.